Thank you very much for that kind and overly generous introduction. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. This reminds me of my bar mitzvah because I haven't had so many people who want to see me since my bar mitzvah. So thank you very much. But they said because I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center, maybe I could persuade Dr. Dre to do a deal with us, and they trotted me out to meet with him. We spent 2 hours, and he didn't really say much. He had his partner doing most of the talking. And then he got up, and he is big. He's 6'4", and he's looked, sculpted. And I said, well, you look like you exercise a lot. He says, yes, 4 hours a day. He said, how much do you do? I said, 4 hours a year. He said he didn't believe I did that much. I am a private equity professional, and I do think that private equity is perhaps the highest calling of mankind. And I came to this decision late in life, and let me just tell you how I got there. And the story I'm going to tell you is a story that some of you may find compatible with your own lives. So my name is David Rubenstein, and if your last name is Rubenstein, you think the person probably has a father who was a nice Jewish lawyer or doctor or dentist or something. But I like to remind people there are blue-collar Jews, and my father was one of them. I grew up in Baltimore. My father dropped out of high school to go into the Marines in World War II. He came back, he met my mother. My mother was 17 when they got married. My father was 19. I was born more than 9 months later. Got a scholarship to go to law school. I wanted to go to law school, and I was growing up. The biggest transformative thing in my life was in the 6th grade, John Kennedy gave his great inaugural address. Some of you may remember it. It was a brilliant speech given in 14 minutes. It was the greatest speech he ever gave. I think the best inaugural address of the 20th century. And my teacher went over that line by line, word by word, and it was really poetry in prose form. And it just instilled in me the idea that maybe the most important thing was to give back to your country and try to do public service. And in those days, that's what I really wanted to do. So I thought if I became a lawyer, I would go into government and do public service and give back to my country. And that was my real goal in life. And I've done a lot in educational matters and medical research and performing arts. But one thing happened to me that changed my life, and let me tell you what the story was. I was coming back from London, and I was on a plane, and I was reading my mail, and I was heading to New York that day. I live in Washington, and it happened that night there was an exhibition of the Magna Carta. I said, how can the Magna Carta be here? It just should have been in London, where I just was. So I decided to go and look at the Magna Carta. I'd never seen a Magna Carta. I got there, and the curator from Sotheby's said, actually, there's 17 copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, and Ross Perot had bought one, the only one in private hands, and a family had had it for 500 years. They sold it to Ross Perot in 1984. His lawyer went over and got it and put it up in a tube and went through customs. The customs person said, what's in that tube? He said, the Magna Carta. I said, sure, go ahead. And they didn't believe it. So it was taken out of the country without an export license, but Sotheby's was going to sell it, and they told me it was probably going to go to somebody from Russia or Saudi Arabia or South Africa. They told me who the likely buyers were probably going to be from the countries. They didn't name the individuals. And I said, geez, this is a document that inspired our Declaration of Independence and our Bill of Rights, and while it wasn't drafted here, it should be here, and so I want to make sure that one copy was here. So I resolved to go back the next night and buy it. And I didn't want to tell my wife because it sounds presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta. And I didn't want to tell my children. They might say, how much less money might this mean for us? So I went back the next night, and I'm not an art collector, and so I really didn't know much about Sotheby's. I went there, and I said, okay, where do I go up and raise my hand? They said, go in this little room. And they put me in a little room. They locked the door. They put up a telephone. And I couldn't hear that well. The transmission wasn't good. And if anybody been in auction, you start bidding, you get carried away. So I started bidding, and all of a sudden, the guy said, sold. So I figured it went to somebody. I couldn't hear it. He came into the room, and he said, actually, you bought it. Who are you? We've never seen you before. I told him my name, and he said, okay, you have the money for this, right? I said, yes. He said, okay, you can slip out the side door and nobody will ever know, or there are 100 reporters there who would like to know who bought the Magna Carta. And I said, well, I'll go out and tell them. And I went out and said that I have been very fortunate in my life to come from very modest means. I now have the ability to give back to my country, and I wanted to give this to the country as a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country. And so I put it on the National Archives on a permanent loan. It'll be there forever, and when I die, it'll stay there forever. And I got in the habit, and then somebody called me the next day and said, well, if you want to buy Magna Carta, I have one. And then I got lots of people.
So given all your successes, can you describe an investment that you did not make and wish you had?
How many hours do you have? Let me mention two of them, to be very serious. My oldest daughter went to Harvard College, and when your daughter goes to college or your son goes to college, you never know what they might come back with. But my daughter met a young man who was terrific. They're married, and he went to Phillips Exeter, Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School. Very smart young man. In Phillips Exeter, his classmate was a young man that he wanted me to meet. He said this young man had a really good company, and he wanted me to maybe look at investing in it, knowing the business I was in. And I heard the company, and I said, companies that really deal with college-related things, they never make it, really. I've seen these things over the years, so I'm not really interested in meeting with them. That person's name is Mark Zuckerberg. The initial $10 million that was put in is today, if you held it, was probably worth $90 billion. So that was a mistake. Another one was this. We own a company called Baker & Taylor, which was the second largest book distributor in the United States. Started in 1839, had not made a profit since 1839, never made a profit. We bought it from W.R. Grace, and we're trying to figure out how to get new revenue from book distribution. And one day a salesman comes in the board meeting and says, I just found some idiot who is willing to buy our bibliography of books in print for a large amount of money, and this could be a new business. So I said, okay, so he's going to pay $500,000, $100,000 a year for 5 years. He said, by the way, I outsmarted this guy. He wanted to give me a third of this new company he was starting that's going to sell books over the internet, but I said, we're too smart for that. We want $100,000 a year for 5 years. Later, I figured out this was Jeff Bezos, and I went out to see him before he went public, and I said, you know, our salesman made a mistake. We'll take the third of the company now. He said, you know, I don't really need your bibliography as much as I did, but you were helpful, so I'm going to give you some stock in lieu of the $100,000 a year payment. So he gave us stock, which was 1% of the company. Today, it's worth about $3.5 billion. Unfortunately, we sold it at the IPO, and we didn't have confidence. So those were two of our big mistakes.
Now, I just want to talk for a few minutes about carried interest. I know you get this question a lot.
I couldn't hear you.
So profits for private equity fund managers that we call carried interest are taxed at more favorable capital gains versus ordinary income tax rates. And I know you told me I could ask you anything.
Sure.
You're in favor of reforming the tax code, and you've said you'd put everything on the table, even carried interest.
Right.
Why, or how do you think about this?
Let me describe, for those who obsess over my tax rate, let me explain what this is. The phrase carried interest actually comes from the Middle Ages. The ancient Venetian ship owners would send ships to get spices to Asia and bring them back. And the people that worked on the ship who were carrying back the spices, they got a carried interest. And it actually was 20% of the profits. And ultimately, when hedge funds and private equity funds were set up, they came to investors with a novel concept of giving them 20% of the profits, and ultimately the investors agreed to it because the returns were good, and that's still part of the industry. A law professor at the University of Illinois at the time, I think he's now at the University of San Diego, wrote an article several years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, pointing out in a law review article that the carried interest that I collect is taxed at the capital gains rate, not the ordinary rate, and he argued that it's really a fee for service. It should be taxed at the ordinary rate. He sent a copy to, I think, every member of Congress, and every member of Congress, you know, really wasn't familiar with it. It got a lot of attention because private equity people were getting in the news for some things that they had done, and as a result, the House passed several times a bill to change it, but it never actually became law. I personally think that it's not quite an investment the way a capital gains kind of investment is, but you are taking risk and you are doing things that are different than just getting a salary. However, my view is the tax code is a bit of a mess. Nobody can understand it. How many people here fill out their own tax returns? Okay, all right. How many people in private equity fill out their own tax returns? Right. So it's very complicated to fill out your own tax returns. It's a very complicated system. And I think the system could use reform, and I think everything should be considered. Nothing should be off the table. I think the next Congress, not this Congress, but the next Congress, the next president, is likely to do it. It probably takes 2 or 3 years to have comprehensive tax reform. And when it occurs, I suspect everything will be on the table. And
now, one of the things I found interesting to finish up here is that outside, I heard you have a vacation home in Nantucket. That you don't get there that often, but there's supposedly a rock with the words painted on it, "I'd rather be working." Right. So can you comment on that? Did you paint that, or is that how you think?
Well, somebody gave it to me, but I'm not famous for relaxing, or, you know, I just feel, well, I guess my theory is that I see a lot of people relaxing and then they drop dead of a heart attack, and sometimes I have a theory that if you keep going forward, your adrenaline will keep pumping. And if I relax, all of a sudden, the inside of my body, the nerves will relax, everything will relax, and a germ will come in and see a relaxed nervous system. So I don't want to relax. I'm afraid if I go to the beach, all of a sudden, then my system will just relax, and germs can come in and attack a weak system. So I keep going forward, and I don't want to slow down. But I love what I'm doing, and if I'm sitting in Nantucket for a week, I would probably go crazy and probably would have a heart attack.
Well, it seems to be working.
So far, you never know. As there was a lawyer from Chicago who was once the chairman of the SEC, and he famously said something along the lines of, "I get most of my exercise being the pallbearer at the funerals of friends of mine who exercise." So now I have a very unusual exercise program. In my homes, I have in a couple of homes, I have elaborate exercise equipment. It's industrial strength, it's great. And I have the theory that there's exercise by osmosis. If I walk past this equipment enough, it'll rub off. And so far, I haven't been injured, or so far, nothing bad has happened. So I think it works.